Once upon a time in the vast expanse of Russia, a leader emerged whose influence echoed across the steppes and soared through the spires of Moscow. His name was Vladimir Putin, a man of calculated strength and a vision as vast as the Siberian tundra. Born in the labyrinthine alleys of Leningrad, Putin's journey began amidst the whispers of the Cold War. From those formative years, he developed a resilience that would shape his destiny. As a young man, he navigated the complexities of KGB service, his sharp mind absorbing the intricate dance of international espionage. Putin's ascent through the political echelons was marked by a quiet intensity, like the brewing storms over the Ural Mountains. He weathered the challenges of a nation in transformation, its identity evolving from Soviet echoes to the vibrant pulse of a new Russia. In the corridors of power, Putin donned the mantle of leadership with a steely gaze and a strategic mind. His policies were the brushstrokes on the canvas of a revitalized Russia, a nation finding its footing on the global stage. From the tumultuous 90s to the stability of the 21st century, Putin steered the ship of state with a captain's resolve. The narrative of Vladimir Putin extended beyond the political chessboard. His image, a blend of rugged strength and calculated diplomacy, resonated not only in the Kremlin, but across international forums. His gaze, firm as the Ural Mountains, surveyed the geopolitical landscape with an unwavering focus. Yet, Putin's story was not a monolith of power. It bore the nuances of a complex character. His love for his homeland was evident in the way he spoke of Russia, a land of resilience, cultural richness, and unyielding pride. As time unfurled, Putin's leadership faced scrutiny and acclaim in equal measure. The story of his Russia was a narrative painted in shades of authority, strategic maneuvering, and a commitment to restoring the nation's global standing. The tale of Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, is one of a man who embraced the responsibility of guiding a nation through tumultuous times. It is a story of a leader whose legacy is etched into the intricate history of a country that spans continents, echoing across the vastness of the Russian landscape.